There was a night in the year 476, somewhere along the Italian coast, when a teenage boy sat alone in a borrowed room that had once belonged to someone far more powerful than he would ever be. He was not quite 14. His name, strangely enough, meant Little Romulus, the Great Augustus, a name built from the founder of Rome and the man who had first called himself emperor. And yet by the time the candle beside him burned low that evening, Rome, the empire that had ruled the Western world for 5 centuries, effectively belonged to no one wearing that name. Nobody rang a bell. Nobody wrote it down as a headline. The last Roman emperor of the West simply stopped being emperor, and most people in Italy that week were far more concerned about the harvest, or the price of bread, or whether the soldiers passing through their town would want a place to sleep. That quiet, almost unnoticed ending is where we are headed tonight. But we are going to take our time getting there, the way the fall of Rome actually happened. Not in a single dramatic night, but slowly in 1,000 small evenings like this one over the better part of 200 years. Hey buddy, welcome back to the quiet past. If you're new here, I'm glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet. This is the place where we let history slow all the way down. No shouting narrators, no dramatic music stings, no countdowns to disaster. Just a long, quiet walk through the past at the pace a candle burns, meant to keep you company as your eyes get heavy and the world outside gets dark. Go ahead and get yourself settled now. Pull the blanket up over your shoulder. Turn the lamp down low or off completely if that's your habit. If you're listening from a phone propped against a pillow, that's perfectly fine too. Wherever you are tonight, whatever city or small town, whatever time it happens to be where you're lying down right now, I want you to take a slow breath in and let it out even slower. There's nowhere else you need to be for the next while. Nothing here requires you to stay sharp or remember dates. Just let the story hold you. And hey, if you haven't already, it would mean a great deal to me if you tapped that subscribe button before you drift off. This channel runs entirely on people like you deciding to come back, and it costs nothing but a tap of your thumb. Then you can close your eyes or leave your phone screen dark beside you and just listen. Tonight's story is a big one. We're going to talk about the fall of Rome, which sounds like it should be a single event, something with a date you could circle on a calendar, but it really isn't. The fall of Rome was less like a wall crashing down all at once, and more like a very old house slowly settling, board by board, over 2 centuries, until one day people realized nobody was living in the West Wing anymore. We're going to walk through those centuries together tonight. We'll sit in the homes of ordinary Roman families. We'll walk the roads with soldiers who no longer quite knew who they were fighting for. We'll feel the cold wind that pushed entire peoples across rivers and mountains in search of somewhere safer to live. And by the end, we'll understand not just when Rome fell, but the much stranger and much more human question of how a civilization that size could simply come apart, thread by thread, without anyone fully realizing it was happening while it happened. Let's go inside. An empire at its fullest. Before we can talk about a fall, we have to understand what exactly was falling. So let's rewind for a moment, back before our story really begins, to around the year 117, during the reign of an emperor named Trajan. This is worth pausing on, because at this point Rome was not a fragile thing. It was, by most measures available to us, the largest and most successful state the ancient world had ever produced. Imagine a map stretched from the damp hills of northern Britain, where soldiers wrapped in wool cloaks watched for raiders beyond a stone wall, all the way to the deserts of Mesopotamia, where the air shimmered with heat and merchants haggled in a dozen languages. In between lay the entire rim of the Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans, with a mixture of pride and simple accuracy, called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Somewhere around 50 to 60 million people lived inside this empire, which was an almost unthinkable number for the ancient world, roughly a fifth of everyone alive on Earth at the time, all of them paying taxes to the same treasury, all of them, at least in theory, protected by the same laws. I want you to imagine what it would have felt like to be an ordinary person living inside that system. Let's say you were a merchant in the city of Lyon in what is now France, and you needed to send a letter to a cousin in Alexandria on the coast of Egypt. You could do that. Roman roads, paved with fitted stone, ran in a great web across the provinces, and a courier could carry your letter along routes that were patrolled, maintained, and marked with milestones every 1,000 paces. If you wanted to travel yourself, you could book passage on a grain ship crossing from Ostia, the port of Rome, down to Carthage, without needing a passport or converting your money more than once, since Roman coinage was recognized nearly everywhere. This kind of ease of movement, this kind of shared law and shared currency across such a vast space, would not really exist again in Europe until the modern era, nearly 2,000 years later. And yet, for all its grandeur, Roman daily life was surprisingly modest and familiar in its textures. Picture a small apartment in Rome itself, in one of the tall brick buildings called insulae, 5 or 6 stories high, with no elevator obviously, and often no reliable plumbing above the ground floor. A family living on the 4th floor would carry water up in clay jars from a public fountain down the street, the handle cutting into their palm a little more each trip. In the evening, the smell of wood smoke and cooking oil would drift out of open windows, mixing with the smell of the street below, where donkeys pulled carts and vendors called out the price of olives or fresh bread. Rome had strict laws about wheeled traffic during daylight hours, so most deliveries happened after dark, which meant that even in the depths of night, the streets below never went entirely silent. Cartwheels on stone, a dog barking somewhere, someone laughing too loudly 3 streets over. This was the empire at its fullest, and it is important that we sit with this image for a moment, because everything that follows tonight is a story about how something this vast, this interconnected, this seemingly permanent, gradually stopped working. Not overnight, not from a single blow, but slowly, the way a rope frays, one strand giving way quietly while the others keep holding, until one day there simply aren't enough strands left. Let's take a breath here and let that image settle. A grandmother in Britain wrapping a wool blanket around her grandchild by a small fire, while 4,000 kilometers away in Syria, a merchant counts out coins stamped with the same emperor's face. That was Rome, and it took 200 years of quiet, grinding change to come apart. The cracks begin to show now. Let's move forward a little more than 100 years, into a period historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century. This stretch, running roughly from the year 235 to 284, is where the first real cracks appear in that grand structure we just walked through. It is not a dramatic collapse. It is closer to a long, uncomfortable fever that the empire eventually survives, but never quite recovers from in the same way. Imagine you are a shopkeeper in a mid-sized town somewhere in Gaul, what we would now call France during this period. You sell bread. Every morning you rise before dawn, when the air is still cold enough to see your breath, and you light the ovens using coals kept warm overnight under a bed of ash. In your grandfather's time, the silver coin called a denarius could buy a decent amount of grain, and prices stayed roughly the same year after year, which made planning your life a fairly steady thing. But now, in your own lifetime, you have watched the coins themselves change. They still look silver from a distance, stamped with the profile of whichever emperor happens to be in power this year. But if you hold one up to the light and scratch it gently with a fingernail, you notice the silver is thinner than it used to be, awash over a core of cheaper metal. The government has been doing this deliberately, stretching the same amount of silver across more and more coins to pay for wars and soldiers' wages without raising taxes outright. It works for a little while. And then it doesn't, because everyone eventually notices, and prices for bread and oil and cloth begin to creep upward in a way that feels less like normal life and more like the ground shifting slightly beneath your feet. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because inflation of this kind is not exciting the way a battle is exciting. It is slow and confusing, and mostly it just makes daily life a little harder in ways that are difficult to point to directly. You don't wake up one morning to a crisis. You wake up one morning and then another and then a season later, and you realize that the coins in your strongbox buy less bread than they used to, and nobody around you can quite explain why, and everyone has simply learned to grumble about it and go on with their day. Layered on top of this quiet economic strain was a genuine and serious problem with leadership. In this 50-year window, the Roman Empire went through more than 20 different emperors, and most of them did not die of old age in their beds. They were assassinated by their own soldiers or killed in battle against rival generals who also wanted the throne, or occasionally poisoned by people within their own household. Imagine, for comparison, if a country changed its head of state through violence roughly once every 2 years for half a century straight. That was the lived experience of the Roman world during this period. If you were a farmer near the Danube River in what is now roughly Serbia or Bulgaria, this instability was not an abstract political story you heard about from travelers. It meant that the army stationed near your town might suddenly declare a new emperor of their own, and demand extra taxes or extra grain to fund the campaign, and there was very little you could do about it except pay, and hope the soldiers passing through your fields this season were reasonably well disciplined. I want you to imagine, for a moment, a small farmhouse along that river frontier. It's late autumn, the kind of gray afternoon where the light barely seems to change from morning to evening. The smoke curls from a low chimney. Inside, a woman is stirring a pot of barley stew over the fire while her husband repairs a wooden yoke for the family's ox, worn smooth from years of plowing the same stretch of land. Outside in the distance, dust rises from a road and both of them pause just briefly to listen. Is that just a merchant's cart or is it soldiers again? This small, quiet moment of listening, this brief pause in an otherwise ordinary afternoon, happened millions of times across the Roman frontier during the 3rd century. Not because disaster was constant, but because uncertainty had become the normal texture of daily life. People adapted to it the way people adapt to almost anything, by building small routines and small hopes around an unpredictable world, and getting on with the business of living. And yet, I should say clearly, the empire did not fall during this crisis. It came very close to fracturing entirely, with parts of Gaul and Britain briefly breaking away under their own separate rulers, and a wealthy trading city called Palmyra, out in the Syrian desert, rising up under a remarkable queen named Zenobia to challenge Roman authority in the east. But by the year 284, a tough, capable soldier named Diocletian took the throne, and he would go on to reshape the entire structure of the empire in ways that both saved it in the short term and quietly set the stage for the divisions we'll spend the rest of tonight exploring. Let's turn to him now and to the strange, sprawling new version of Rome he built. Diocletian and the empire split in two. Diocletian came from humble origins, likely the son of a former slave from the province of Dalmatia, along the Adriatic coast. He rose through the ranks of the army the hard way, through decades of competent, unglamorous service, and by the time he took the throne, he had a soldier's practical understanding of the empire's core problem. It was simply too large for one man to govern and defend at the same time. News of a barbarian raid on the Rhine frontier might take weeks to reach an emperor stationed in Rome, and by the time he marched an army north to respond, the situation on the ground may have already changed entirely, or a second crisis might have broken out somewhere else while his back was turned. So Diocletian did something that had never quite been tried before at this scale. He divided the empire's administration into 4 parts, a system historians now call the tetrarchy, meaning the rule of 4. Two senior emperors, each called an Augustus, would govern the eastern and western halves of the empire, and each would have a junior partner called a Caesar who would eventually succeed him. On paper, this was elegant. In practice, it meant that for the first time the idea of Rome as a single governed place began to loosen. There were now, effectively, 4 different capitals, 4 different courts, 4 different sets of soldiers loyal to 4 different men, and the city of Rome itself, that ancient symbolic heart of the empire, was not even one of them. Diocletian ruled from Nicomedia in what is now northwestern Turkey. His western counterpart eventually ruled from cities like Milan and Trier, closer to the frontiers that actually needed defending. Try to imagine what this shift might have felt like to an ordinary family living in the city of Rome itself during this period. For centuries, Rome had been the unquestioned center of the world, the place where the Senate met, where triumphant generals paraded through the streets, where every road on every map seemed to point. And now quietly the actual business of empire, the soldiers, the treasuries, the emperors themselves, had drifted elsewhere, to cities closer to the frontiers. Rome remained enormous, wealthy, and proud, filled with markets and bathhouses and grand temples, but it had become something closer to a beautiful old capital in name, a city living increasingly on the memory of its own importance, rather than the living center of decision-making it had once been. There is something quietly sad in that, if you sit with it. A place can remain full of people, full of noise and bread and daily errands, and still lose the thing that once made it the center of the world, simply because power has quietly walked out the door and set up somewhere else. Diocletian also tried to fix the empire's economic troubles directly. In the year 301, he issued what's called the Edict on Maximum Prices, an attempt to legally freeze the cost of goods across the empire, from a pound of pork to a day's wages for a farmhand, in order to stop the inflation that had been grinding away at ordinary households for decades. It's worth pausing on this because it tells us something very human about how governments respond to problems they don't fully understand the roots of. You cannot simply order prices to stay the same when the underlying value of your currency has already been undermined. Merchants, faced with a legal price lower than what their goods actually cost them to produce, mostly responded by quietly refusing to sell at all, and black markets sprang up instead. The edict largely failed within a few years, and it was eventually abandoned, but it's a small human reminder that the people living through this collapse were not passive victims of distant forces. They were trying things. They were reasoning, adapting, occasionally getting it wrong, in exactly the way any of us might if we found ourselves living through slow economic decline with only the tools and understanding available at the time. Diocletian retired in the year 305, which was itself remarkable, since almost no Roman emperor had ever voluntarily given up power before. He spent his final years growing cabbages on an estate along the Adriatic coast, and when former colleagues later begged him to return to politics during a fresh round of civil war, he is said to have replied that if they could only see the cabbages he had grown with his own hands, they would never ask him to trade this piece for the burdens of the throne again. It's a small, oddly touching detail to hold onto amid all this larger history. Even the man who redesigned the entire administrative structure of the Roman world in the end simply wanted a garden and some quiet. But his system of 4 rulers did not hold together for long after he stepped down. The Caesars and Augusti began fighting among themselves almost immediately, and it would take another 2 decades of civil war before a single figure, a general named Constantine, managed to reunite the empire under one ruler again. Constantine is a story worth its own quiet evening by the fire, honestly, but for our purposes tonight, there are 2 decisions of his that matter enormously for the story of Rome's eventual fall. The first is that Constantine made Christianity a fully tolerated, and eventually favored, religion within the empire, ending centuries of periodic persecution and beginning a slow transformation of Roman culture, art, and daily worship that would reshape the entire civilization from the inside out. The second, and perhaps even more consequential for our story tonight, is that Constantine founded a new capital city in the east, on the site of an old Greek trading town called Byzantium, along the narrow strait that divides Europe from Asia. He named it, with a certain lack of modesty, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. And he poured the wealth of the empire into building it up with new walls, new palaces, a new forum, and a new Senate house, deliberately meant to rival Rome itself. Let's pause here again and imagine the view from a ship approaching this new city for the first time, perhaps in the year 340, a few years after Constantine's death. The strait itself is narrow enough that you can see both shores at once, dotted with fishing villages and olive groves. And then the city rises ahead of you, still under construction in places, scaffolding visible against half-finished walls, but already grand, already busy with ships unloading grain from Egypt and wine from the Aegean Islands. This is the seed of what will eventually become the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that will, remarkably, outlive the western half by nearly 1,000 years. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, what matters is simply this. By the middle of the 4th century, the Roman world had two great cities pulling at its center of gravity, one ancient and proud in Italy and one new and rising in the east, and the empire's resources, attention, and loyalty were increasingly divided between them. This division would matter enormously in the century to come, because when real trouble finally arrived at Rome's borders, the empire was no longer one unified body responding as a single whole. It was in practice two separate governments, sharing a name and a history, but increasingly making their own decisions, defending their own territory, and looking out for their own survival. And trouble, as it happened, was already beginning to gather far to the east, on a cold, wind-swept stretch of grassland where a people the Romans knew almost nothing about were beginning to move. Let's go inside their world for a while. A people on the move far to the northeast of the Roman frontier, beyond the Danube River, beyond even the lands the Romans considered barbarian territory, there lived a confederation of tribes we now call the Goths. By the middle of the 4th century, the Goths had been living near the Roman border for generations, close enough that trade, and sometimes marriage and occasionally warfare, had woven their world and the Roman world together in ways more complicated than the simple word barbarian suggests. Roman writers used that word constantly, but it's worth remembering it was mostly a term of convenience and condescension, not a precise description. Many Gothic communities farmed the same kind of wheat and barley as their Roman neighbors, wore woven wool clothing dyed with the same local plants, and had absorbed a fair amount of Roman coinage, Roman pottery, and even Roman military technique through decades of contact along the border. Let's go inside a Gothic settlement for a moment, somewhere along the lower Danube, on an ordinary evening sometime around the year 370. Picture a cluster of long, low wooden houses, their roofs thatched thick against the cold, smoke rising from holes cut near the roofline rather than proper chimneys. Inside one of these homes, a family gathers close to a central hearth, the fire's orange light catching on carved wooden beams and hanging strings of dried herbs. A grandmother works wool with a hand spindle, twisting it steadily between her fingers while she talks quietly with her daughter about the coming winter. Outside, a group of men return from checking on the horses, their breath visible in the cold evening air, boots crunching over half-frozen mud. This was not a chaotic or primitive world, whatever the old stereotypes might suggest. It was a settled agricultural society with its own laws, its own religious practices, its own sense of honor and family obligation, simply organized differently than Roman civic life, without the same dense cities or centralized bureaucracy. But in the early 370s, something happened far to the east that would upend this entire world, and it came from a people the Goths themselves found genuinely terrifying. We call them the Huns, a nomadic confederation of horse-mounted warriors who swept out of the steppes of Central Asia, and by the time they reached the lands of the Gothic peoples, they brought with them a style of warfare that was almost entirely unfamiliar. Roman and Gothic writers alike describe the Huns mounted archers with a kind of shocked fascination, men who seemed to live on horseback, who could loose arrows accurately while riding at full gallop, and who moved with a speed and unpredictability that traditional infantry and cavalry simply weren't built to counter. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the fear that would travel ahead of an army like that, carried not by any official messenger, but simply by refugees moving faster than news usually moved. A family herding their remaining livestock westward, having already lost their home, their harvest, perhaps a relative, telling anyone who would listen about riders who appeared out of nowhere on the horizon and vanished just as quickly. Stories like this spread through Gothic territory in the early 370s, and whatever the precise details, the underlying truth was clear enough. Staying put was no longer safe. And so in the year 376, a massive number of Gothic people, likely somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 men, women, and children, arrived at the southern bank of the Danube River and asked the Roman Empire for permission to cross into Roman territory. Let's sit with that image for a long moment, because it's one of the most important and most human moments in this entire story. This was not an invading army arriving with weapons drawn. This was, by most contemporary accounts, a desperate and orderly request for asylum. Families with wagons loaded with whatever possessions they'd managed to save. Elderly parents carried or supported by their children. Livestock driven along riverside paths, thin and travel-worn. They stood on the far bank of a wide, cold river, looking across at Roman soldiers watching them from fortified towers, and they waited for an answer. The Roman emperor in the east at the time was a man named Valens, and the decision facing him was genuinely difficult, in a way that's easy to lose sight of when we know how the story eventually turns out. On one hand, allowing this many people to cross the frontier all at once was an enormous administrative and logistical challenge, one that Roman officials on the ground were almost certainly not prepared to handle well. On the other hand, turning away that many desperate people, many of them potential farmers and soldiers who could strengthen the empire's frontier population, seemed both cruel and strategically short-sighted. Valens ultimately agreed to let the Goths cross, but the actual execution of that decision, carried out by local Roman officials rather than the emperor himself, went badly almost from the start. Roman administrators overseeing the crossing were, by multiple accounts, corrupt and poorly organized. Food promised to the Gothic refugees was withheld or sold to them at extortionate prices, sometimes reportedly in exchange for their own children being taken into slavery, as payment for dog meat during a famine that the Romans themselves had created through mismanagement of supplies. I want to be careful here, because ancient sources exaggerate and moralize, and we should hold the most dramatic, specific details a little loosely. But the broader pattern described across multiple independent accounts is consistent and believable. A desperate population was mistreated by the very administration meant to be settling them, and resentment, entirely understandable resentment, began to build among people who had crossed that river hoping for safety and instead found exploitation. By the following year, that resentment had turned into open rebellion. Gothic forces, joined by other groups who had likewise crossed into Roman territory or who sympathized with their treatment, began raiding and fighting Roman forces across the Balkan provinces. And in the year 378, this long, slow chain of decisions and mistakes led to a single afternoon outside a city called Adrianople, in what is now northwestern Turkey, a battle that would send a shockwave through the entire Roman world. Let's walk through that day together now, slowly, the way it likely unfolded. The afternoon Adrianople, the 9th of August in the year 378, began, by most accounts, as an unusually hot late summer day on the plains outside Adrianople. Emperor Valens had marched his army there to confront the Gothic forces, and he did so somewhat impatiently, having received word that his nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, was marching with reinforcements but had not yet arrived. There's a very human dynamic at play here, worth pausing on. Valens, by several accounts, did not want to share the glory of victory with his younger co-emperor, and scouting reports he received about the size of the Gothic force were apparently inaccurate, underestimating just how many warriors he was actually about to face. Imagine the Roman soldiers that morning, having marched for hours across dry, dusty terrain under a punishing sun, many of them without adequate water, their armor growing unbearably hot against their skin. Roman infantry of this era typically wore segmented armor over a padded tunic, along with a helmet, and carried a large shield along with a short sword or spear. All of that equipment, sensible for a controlled, disciplined battle, becomes a genuine burden in extreme heat and exhaustion, and by the time the Roman forces arrived near the Gothic wagon encampment, many of the men were already worn down before the fighting had even begun. Negotiations were attempted first, which is often forgotten in the retelling of this battle. There were talks, messages sent back and forth, a real possibility that the day might end without a major engagement at all. But somewhere in the confusion, possibly through an unauthorized skirmish begun by soldiers on one side or the other, actual fighting broke out. And once it did, it spiraled quickly beyond anyone's control. The Gothic cavalry, which had apparently been away from the main camp when negotiations began, returned at exactly the wrong moment for the Romans, catching a significant portion of the Roman army from an unexpected angle while they were still maneuvering into formation. What followed was, by the account of the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who wrote about these events not long after they happened, one of the worst defeats the Roman military had suffered in centuries. The heat, the dust, the crowding of soldiers who could not maneuver properly, the cavalry strike from an unexpected direction, all of it combined into a chaotic, crushing defeat. Ammianus describes the Roman lines becoming so densely packed together that soldiers could barely raise their weapons, crushed against each other, unable to retreat, unable to properly fight. Somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the entire Eastern Roman field army was killed that single afternoon, including Emperor Valens himself, whose body was reportedly never recovered from the field, or possibly burned beyond recognition in a farmhouse where he had taken shelter, and which the Goths set alight, not realizing the emperor was inside. I want you to sit with the scale of that loss for a moment, not in a dramatic way, but simply to understand what it meant going forward. Roman field armies took years, sometimes decades, to properly train, equip, and integrate into an effective fighting force. Losing the majority of an entire regional army in a single afternoon was not something that could be quickly repaired with new recruits. It left the eastern frontier dangerously thin, and it sent a message, both to Rome's own citizens and to every group watching from beyond the frontier, that the Roman military machine, long considered nearly unbeatable in open battle, could in fact be broken. The historian Ammianus himself seemed to sense the weight of this moment even as he wrote about it, comparing the defeat at Adrianople to Rome's catastrophic ancient loss at the Battle of Cannae, centuries earlier against Hannibal. That's a telling comparison, because Cannae had also been remembered, generation after generation, as a wound the Roman psyche never fully forgot, even though Rome had eventually gone on to win that war and build an empire far larger than the one that existed at Cannae's time. Adrianople carried a similar weight of shock, but this time, the empire's ability to simply out-recruit and out-produce its way back to dominance was much more limited than it had been centuries earlier. There was no vast reserve of untapped Italian manpower left to call upon in quite the same way, and the economic strains of the previous century meant that raising, training, and paying a new army was a slower, harder process than it once had been. In the years immediately following Adrianople, a new emperor named Theodosius, appointed to take over the eastern half of the empire, chose a path that was pragmatic, if uncomfortable to Roman pride. Rather than continuing to fight the Gothic forces to complete destruction or total submission, he negotiated a treaty in 382 that allowed the Goths to settle within Roman territory as a distinct self-governing group, obligated to provide soldiers for the Roman army, but not fully absorbed as ordinary Roman citizens or a conquered people in the traditional sense. This arrangement is sometimes called a foedus, and the peoples living under it are called foederati. Let's think for a moment about what that actually meant for daily life on the ground in the Balkan provinces over the following years. Imagine a Roman farmer near the city of Thessalonica, watching Gothic families settle into fields nearby, families who spoke a different language, followed different customs, and yet were technically allies of Rome, sometimes garrisoned nearby with their own weapons and their own commanders, answering more to their own leaders than to any Roman governor. This was a genuinely new kind of arrangement, and it blurred a line that Roman identity had rested on for centuries, the line between citizen and foreigner, between Roman soldier and barbarian warrior. Increasingly, over the coming decades, that line would blur further and further, until eventually it would become difficult to say with confidence where the Roman army ended and allied barbarian forces began. This is worth pausing on, because it's easy, looking back with hindsight, to imagine the fall of Rome as a story of civilization being invaded by outsiders. But the reality on the ground in these decades was far more tangled than that. Many of the so-called barbarian groups settling within Roman borders wanted, quite genuinely, to become part of the Roman world, to farm its land, serve in its armies, benefit from its trade networks and legal protections. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is less about invasion and conquest, and more about a Roman state that increasingly lacked the administrative strength, the financial resources, and eventually the political will to properly integrate, manage, and defend the sprawling, complicated population it now contained. Let's step back from the battlefield now, and spend some time in a quieter setting, inside an ordinary Roman home in the same period, to understand how these enormous political shifts were actually experienced by the people living through them day to day. An ordinary evening in a changing world. Let's go inside a home now. Not a palace, not a barracks, just an ordinary household, somewhere in northern Italy in the final years of the 4th century. I want you to imagine a modest stone and timber house on the edge of a market town, the kind of place a moderately prosperous farming family might own, with a small courtyard, a few chickens scratching in the dirt, and grapevines trained along a low wall at the back. It's early evening and the sky is turning that soft violet color it gets just after sunset in late autumn. Inside, a woman named, let's say, Emilia, is preparing the evening meal over a hearth built into one corner of the main room. She stirs a pot of lentils flavored with a bit of cured pork fat and wild herbs gathered earlier that day, the smell filling the low-ceilinged room along with the wood smoke that never quite finds its way entirely out through the small vents near the roofline. Her husband Marcus sits nearby mending a leather strap on a farming tool, his hands rough and sure from years of similar work, the leather creaking softly as he pulls the awl through. Their oldest son, 17 years old, is not home this evening, and this absence is worth pausing on, because it tells us something important about how deeply these larger historical forces reached into ordinary family life. In the later Roman Empire, tax and recruitment obligations were increasingly tied not just to money, but to bodies, to actual young men who could be conscripted into military service, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under considerable local pressure from officials trying to meet recruitment quotas set by a distant administration. Aemilia's son had been sent, some months earlier, to serve with a local garrison unit, not as a grand act of patriotic devotion, but largely because the family's landholding obligated them to provide a certain number of recruits, and it was simply easier and slightly less costly to send their own son than to pay the increasingly steep exemption fee that wealthier families used to keep their own sons out of service. This detail matters because it shows us something history books often skip past. The burden of Rome's endless military needs in this period did not fall evenly. Wealthy landowners, particularly senatorial families with connections in Rome or Constantinople, often found legal and financial ways to avoid having their own sons conscripted, while poorer and middling families like Aemilia's absorbed much more of the actual human cost. This created a quiet, grinding resentment in many corners of the empire, a sense that the burdens of defending Rome were being unfairly distributed, even as the empire's overall need for soldiers only grew more urgent with each passing decade. As the meal finishes cooking, Aemilia's younger daughter comes in from outside, cheeks pink from the cold, carrying a small armful of firewood she's gathered from the edge of their property. She settles by the hearth, and Marcus asks her, in the gentle, unremarkable way parents ask children about their day, whether she saw anyone on the road. She mentions, almost as an aside, that a group of travelers passed through earlier, refugees, she thinks, moving south, away from some trouble further north along the frontier. Nobody in the room reacts with alarm. This kind of news, small movements of displaced people, rumors of trouble somewhere else, had become simply part of the background texture of life by this point, the way we might mention traffic delays or weather warnings today. It was concerning in a distant sort of way, but not yet something that reshaped the plans for tomorrow. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because I think it captures something true and important about how large historical collapses are actually experienced by ordinary people while they're happening. There was no single morning when the residents of northern Italy woke up and said, "Today, the empire is falling." Instead, there were thousands of small evenings like this one where troubling news arrived, was discussed briefly over dinner, and then set aside because there was still firewood to gather and a meal to finish and children to put to bed, and life, however uncertain, still had to be lived one ordinary day at a time. After dinner, the family moves closer to the fire as the temperature drops outside. Marcus mentions, quietly, that grain prices at the local market had risen again that week, and that he'd heard the local tax collector was expected to come through within the month to assess this year's payment in kind. Since much of Roman taxation by this period was collected directly in goods, grain, wine, cloth, rather than purely in coin, a system that had grown more common as trust in the currency's stability had eroded over the preceding century. Aemilia sighs, not dramatically, just the tired sigh of someone doing familiar arithmetic in her head about how much they can spare and still have enough to see the family through winter. This is the texture of decline, and it's worth understanding clearly, because it looks almost nothing like the dramatic imagery we often associate with the fall of great civilizations. There is no burning skyline in this scene. There is a family eating lentils by firelight, worrying about taxes and a son away at a garrison post, gently unsettled by rumors of trouble to the north, and getting on with an ordinary evening because that is simply what people do in every era under every kind of pressure. The fall of Rome, when it finally comes, will not feel to most people like the end of the world. It will feel mostly like one more difficult year layered on top of many other difficult years, until eventually the difficulties stop resolving themselves the way they once did. Let's leave this family now to their evening and travel south to the one city whose name still carried more weight than any other in the ancient world, to see what happens when trouble that had been gathering at a distance for decades finally arrives at Rome's own gates. Alaric the Gates, the man at the center of Rome's next great crisis, was named Alaric, a Gothic leader who had actually spent time serving within the Roman military system himself, commanding foederati troops in campaigns for the empire before eventually turning against it. This detail matters because it reminds us again how deeply intertwined the Roman and Gothic worlds had become by this point. Alaric was not some distant, foreign conqueror who had never set foot in Roman territory before. He understood Roman military organization, Roman politics, and Roman weaknesses, in part because he had operated within that very system for years. By the early years of the 5th century, Alaric had grown frustrated repeatedly with the Roman government's treatment of his people. Promised payments and land settlements were delayed or denied. Political instability in the Western imperial court, now based in the well-defended city of Ravenna rather than Rome itself, meant that agreements made with one official were sometimes reversed by the next. And so across several years, Alaric led his forces into Italy multiple times, each time essentially negotiating, through the presence of an army outside a city's walls, for the payments, land, and recognition that diplomacy alone had failed to secure. Let's go inside Rome itself now, in the summer of 410, in the days leading up to what would become one of the most symbolically significant moments in the entire story of the empire's decline. Rome, by this point, was no longer the empire's administrative capital. That role had shifted to Ravenna in the west and Constantinople in the east, but it remained, in every emotional and symbolic sense, the ancient heart of Roman identity. It was still an enormous city by ancient standards, home to perhaps 500,000 people, filled with monuments celebrating 1,000 years of history, a place people across the empire had never visited but still thought of in some sense as the true center of their world. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome that August, past the Colosseum, still in active use for public spectacles, past the grand baths of Caracalla, where citizens gathered daily to socialize, exercise, and bathe in elaborately heated pools, past the ancient temples of the Forum, worn smooth by centuries of feet passing over their steps. And now imagine the tension threaded through all of this ordinary daily activity. Because Alaric's forces had been camped outside the city's walls on and off for nearly 2 years, and the population inside had already endured at least one previous siege that brought them to the edge of starvation, forcing desperate residents to eat food they would never otherwise have considered. By the 3rd week of August in the year 410, whether through betrayal by disgruntled slaves who opened a gate, or through negotiation, or through some combination the sources don't fully agree on, Alaric's forces entered the city. And here it's worth pausing to correct a common misconception, because the popular imagination often pictures the sack of Rome as an act of total, indiscriminate destruction, a city burned to the ground, and its population slaughtered wholesale. The actual events, based on contemporary accounts, were considerably more restrained than that image suggests, though certainly still traumatic and violent for those who lived through it. Alaric, as a Christian himself, reportedly ordered his troops to respect the sanctity of Christian churches, and multiple accounts describe residents who took shelter inside church buildings, including St. Peter's Basilica, being left largely unharmed. The sack lasted only 3 days, a relatively short duration for this kind of event in the ancient world. And while there was certainly looting, some burning of buildings, and violence against those who resisted or who were simply unlucky enough to be caught in the wrong place, the city as a whole was not razed. Many of Rome's monuments, temples, and public buildings survived largely intact, and normal life in a battered and shaken form resumed within the city not long after Alaric's forces departed to continue southward. And yet, the psychological impact of this event across the entire Roman world was almost impossible to overstate. Rome had not been captured by a foreign force in nearly 800 years, not since a Gallic tribe had briefly taken the city back in 390 BCE, an event so distant it had passed into legend rather than living memory. For 8 centuries, whatever chaos gripped the frontiers, whatever civil wars tore through the provinces, the city of Rome itself had remained untouched, a symbol of permanence and protection that transcended the actual practical realities of where power now resided. Its fall, even in this comparatively restrained form, shattered something in how people across the empire understood their own world. The Christian scholar Jerome, living far away in Bethlehem at the time, wrote with genuine anguish upon hearing the news, describing his voice failing him as he tried to dictate his response, saying that the city which had conquered the entire world had itself now been conquered. This wasn't political commentary from a distant observer. This was something closer to grief, the kind of grief you feel when something you assumed would always simply exist, unquestioned in the background of the world, turns out to be fragile after all. I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment, because I think most of us have experienced some smaller version of it in our own lives. A moment when something we assumed was simply permanent, a relationship, a job, a place we lived, a version of the world we took entirely for granted, turned out to be far more fragile than we'd realized. That is in many ways the emotional core of what the sack of Rome meant to people living through it in 410. Not necessarily immediate, visible destruction on a massive scale, but a quiet, deep shock to the assumption of permanence itself. Alaric himself did not live long after this event, dying later that same year, reportedly from illness, while his forces were moving further south through Italy. According to one enduring, if difficult to verify, tradition, his followers diverted a river near the town of Cosenza, buried him in the dry riverbed along with a considerable amount of treasure, and then released the river to flow back over the site, killing the slaves who had done the work in order to keep the location of his grave a permanent secret. Whether or not every detail of that story is accurate, it captures something true about how his own people understood him, as a figure significant enough to warrant an almost mythic burial. Let's move forward now several decades to see how this pattern, wealthy and desperate peoples pressed by outside forces, an overstretched Roman government trying to hold together an increasingly fragile settlement of competing loyalties, would eventually reach its breaking point entirely. The Vandals crossed the sea while Alaric and his Goths were making their long, complicated journey through Italy. Another crisis was quietly unfolding on the other side of the Western Empire, one that would ultimately do even greater damage to Rome's ability to feed itself. On the final day of the year 406 or thereabouts, a coalition of peoples including the Vandals, along with groups called the Suebi and the Alans, crossed the frozen Rhine River into Roman Gaul, apparently taking advantage of a Roman garrison that had been weakened or withdrawn to deal with other crises elsewhere in the empire. I want you to imagine that crossing for a moment, because it would have been a genuinely difficult and dangerous undertaking, even with the river frozen enough to walk across. Entire families, elderly relatives, small children, herds of livestock, all moving across ice in the depths of winter, uncertain footing beneath them, uncertain what awaited them on the far side. This was not a casual raid. This was, once again, a substantial movement of entire peoples, driven from their previous homelands by pressures further east, ultimately traceable, at least in part, back to the same disruptive arrival of the Huns that had originally pushed the Goths toward the Danube decades earlier. Roman Gaul, already strained by decades of internal instability, simply did not have the military strength in place to stop this crossing or effectively contain the movement that followed. Over the next several years, these groups moved through Gaul and eventually into Spain, causing considerable disruption and destruction along the way, though again, we should be careful not to imagine this purely as senseless devastation. Like the Goths before them, many of these peoples were ultimately seeking land to settle, not simply plunder to carry away, and various agreements, some more stable than others, were eventually reached allowing different groups to settle in different Spanish provinces. The Vandals, under a capable and ambitious king named Alaric, eventually pushed further still, crossing from Spain into North Africa in the year 429. This is worth pausing on carefully because North Africa was not some peripheral, unimportant Roman territory. It was in many ways the breadbasket of the Western Empire, an enormously productive agricultural region that shipped vast quantities of grain across the Mediterranean to feed the population of Rome itself, much the way Egypt fed Constantinople in the east. The province included the great city of Carthage, itself one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the entire Western Mediterranean. Let's go inside Carthage for a moment, in the years just before Gaisaric's forces arrived, to understand what was actually at stake. Picture a bustling port city, warehouses along the docks stacked high with amphorae of olive oil and grain awaiting shipment, merchants conducting business in the shade of colonnaded streets, the harbor itself crowded with grain ships preparing for the crossing to Ostia. This was a city of genuine wealth and sophistication, with grand public buildings, a thriving intellectual and religious culture, home to important Christian thinkers and bishops, including, not long before this period, the great theologian Augustine, who had served as bishop in the nearby city of Hippo and had died there in 430, the very year Gaisaric's forces began besieging that city. Reportedly with the elderly Augustine spending his final days in prayer as the siege tightened around the walls. Gaisaric's forces captured Carthage itself in 439, and this single event may have done more practical damage to the Western Roman Empire's ability to actually function than any single military defeat that came before it. With North Africa lost, Rome's grain supply, the literal food that fed its enormous urban population, became dangerously uncertain. Beyond that, the wealthy tax revenues that region had provided for centuries were now gone entirely, redirected instead to fund Gaisaric's own kingdom, which he ruled from Carthage as an independent power, no longer even nominally under Roman authority. I want you to imagine once more the effect this had on ordinary daily life back in the city of Rome itself. Bread had been distributed to a significant portion of Rome's population for free or heavily subsidized prices for centuries, funded in large part by the agricultural wealth of North Africa, a policy meant to keep the enormous urban population fed, content, and less likely to riot. With that supply now cut off or severely disrupted, ordinary families who had relied on this support for generations suddenly faced genuine uncertainty about their next meal. In a city that had once been synonymous with abundance and imperial generosity, Alaric was not finished causing trouble for Rome either. In the year 455, his fleet crossed the Mediterranean once more, this time landing directly at Rome's port and marching on the city itself. Unlike Alaric's relatively restrained sack 45 years earlier, the Vandal sack of Rome in 455 was considerably more thorough in its plundering, though even here later medieval legend exaggerated the destruction considerably. And it's worth noting that the word vandalism, which we still use today to describe senseless destruction, actually comes from later, somewhat unfair, stereotyping of Gaisaric's people since the actual historical sack, while certainly harsh and destructive of considerable wealth and property, did not involve wholesale slaughter or the burning of the city to the ground. Still, imagine what it would have felt like to be a resident of Rome that spring, watching Vandal ships approach the coast for the second time in living memory that the city had faced such a threat, and watching once again, as looters moved through homes and public buildings, carrying away statues, precious metals, and treasures that had been accumulated over centuries. Pope Leo I, the same figure who had reportedly persuaded Attila the Hun to turn back from Italy a few years earlier, an encounter we'll return to shortly, met with Gaisaric as well and reportedly negotiated at least some limits on the violence, though he could not prevent the plundering itself. By this point, roughly halfway through the 5th century, the pattern should be becoming clear to us, sitting here tonight with the benefit of knowing how the whole story ends. The Western Roman Empire was steadily losing the very things that had made it an empire in the first place: its most productive territories, its ability to reliably collect taxes and feed its population, its capacity to field armies large enough to actually defend its remaining borders. And yet, remarkably, the empire did not simply collapse all at once, even now. It staggered forward for another 2 decades, propped up by a shrinking territorial base, increasingly dependent on the very barbarian peoples it had once considered outsiders to fill the ranks of what remained of its military. Let's turn now to one more great crisis of this period, perhaps the most famous single figure in this entire story, a man whose name has echoed through history as a symbol of terror, though the reality of his brief but dramatic involvement with Rome is, as always, more complicated and more interesting than the legend suggests. Attila, and the last great Roman general by the 440s, the Huns, that same nomadic confederation whose westward movement had originally pushed the Goths toward the Danube some 70 years earlier, had themselves settled into a powerful kingdom on the plains of what is now Hungary, under the leadership of a man whose name would become, for centuries afterward, a byword for terror across Europe: Attila. It's worth taking a moment to separate the historical Attila from the legendary figure he later became in medieval and modern imagination. He was, by the accounts of Roman diplomats who actually met him in person, including a fascinating first-hand account left by a Roman official named Priscus, a surprisingly restrained and pragmatic ruler in many personal respects. Priscus describes visiting Attila's court and being struck by how simply the Hunnic king lived compared to the lavish Roman and Gothic nobility surrounding him, eating from plain wooden dishes while his guests ate from ornate silver plates, wearing plain clothing without golden ornamentation while his own commanders dressed far more elaborately. This is a small, striking detail, worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the simple image of Attila as nothing more than a savage destroyer. He seems, from this account at least, to have been a man who understood the theater of power quite well, someone secure enough in his own authority that he didn't need to advertise it through personal luxury. That said, Attila was also, without question, one of the most militarily dangerous figures the late Roman world faced, commanding a vast confederation of Hunnic and allied Germanic forces, and extracting enormous annual payments of gold from the Eastern Roman Empire simply in exchange for not attacking its territory, a kind of protection payment that the Eastern court in Constantinople found humiliating but pragmatically necessary given the alternative. In the year 451, Attila turned his attention westward, leading a massive invasion into Roman Gaul. This is the moment when we meet the man who is, in many respects, the last truly capable Roman general the Western Empire would ever produce, a figure named Flavius Aetius. Aetius had spent years of his youth as a hostage among the Huns himself, a common diplomatic practice of the era meant to secure peace between rival powers, and this period had given him an unusually deep understanding of Hunnic tactics, language, and leadership, knowledge that would prove enormously valuable when he eventually faced Attila as an enemy commander rather than a hostage guest. Facing an invasion of this scale, Aetius did something that captures, perhaps better than any other single moment in this story, just how thoroughly the old distinction between Roman and barbarian had dissolved by this point in history. He assembled an army that was, in practical terms, barely Roman at all in its composition. It consisted primarily of Visigothic forces, the descendants of the same Gothic peoples who had crossed the Danube decades earlier and eventually sacked Rome under Alaric, along with various other allied Germanic groups, all fighting alongside what remained of actual Roman legionary forces, which by this point made up only a portion of the total army. Let's imagine for a moment the scene on the eve of the resulting battle, fought near a place called the Catalonian Plains, sometimes also called the Battle of Chalons, somewhere in what is now northeastern France, in June of the year 451. Picture two enormous armies, each drawn from a patchwork of different peoples, different languages, different traditions, camped within sight of each other across open farmland, campfires stretching further than the eye could comfortably follow in the darkness. This was in a very real sense not simply Rome against the barbarians, but one alliance of European peoples against another, with Rome itself now functioning as just one partner, albeit still an important one, within a broader coalition. The battle itself, when it came, was enormous and brutal, and by most accounts resulted in staggering casualties on both sides, though the specific numbers given by ancient sources are almost certainly exaggerated, as they usually are for battles of this era. What matters most for our story is the outcome. Aetius and his Visigothic allies managed to check Attila's advance, forcing the Hunnic king to withdraw from Gaul, in what is generally considered the last major military victory achieved in the name of the Western Roman Empire. Attila, remarkably, was not finished. The following year, in 452, he turned his attention to Italy itself, and this time there was no combined Roman and Gothic army large enough to stop him in open battle. He moved through northern Italy, and one of the enduring, though somewhat legendary, moments of this campaign involves a meeting between Attila and Pope Leo I, near the Mincio River, where the Pope reportedly persuaded Attila to withdraw from Italy entirely, rather than marching on Rome itself. Historians today debate exactly why Attila actually turned back. Later Christian tradition attributes it entirely to the Pope's spiritual authority and eloquence, sometimes even claiming Attila saw a vision of Saint Peter and Saint Paul threatening him during the meeting. The more grounded historical explanation likely involves a combination of factors, including disease spreading through Attila's own camp, difficulty supplying his enormous army amid a poor harvest year in northern Italy, and news that Eastern Roman forces were launching attacks against Hunnic territory back home, giving Attila good practical reasons to withdraw regardless of what was said in any meeting with the Pope. But whatever the true balance of causes, the meeting itself, real diplomacy layered with growing legend even in its own time, captures something important about this era, a moment when spiritual and political authority were becoming increasingly intertwined in the vacuum left by weakening imperial power. Attila died the following year in 453, reportedly on his wedding night to a new bride, from what was likely a severe nosebleed while heavily intoxicated that caused him to choke in his sleep, an oddly unglamorous end for a figure who had inspired such widespread terror across Europe. His vast empire, which had depended heavily on his own personal authority to hold together such a diverse confederation of peoples, splintered rapidly after his death, and the Hunnic threat that had loomed over Europe for decades faded away almost as quickly as it had arrived. Aetius, the general who had held together the last great Roman military victory in the West, did not long survive his own triumph either. In 454, the Western Emperor Valentinian III, apparently suspicious of Aetius's growing influence and power, personally murdered him during a meeting at the imperial court in Ravenna. It's a bitterly ironic ending, worth sitting with for a moment. The man who had just organized the defense that saved Italy from the most feared conqueror of the age was killed not by any enemy of Rome, but by the very emperor he had served, out of fear and political insecurity. Valentinian himself was assassinated the following year by loyal supporters of Aetius seeking revenge, and the Western imperial throne, already weakened by decades of territorial loss and military strain, now entered its final chaotic chapter with a rapid succession of short-lived emperors, most of them controlled or installed by powerful military commanders who held the real authority behind increasingly powerless imperial figureheads. Let's slow down now and turn to that final chapter, the quiet, almost anticlimactic ending of an empire that had once ruled from Britain to the edge of Persia. The last emperor after the deaths of Aetius and Valentinian in 454 and 455, the Western Roman throne became something closer to a revolving door than a stable institution. Between 455 and 476, 9 different men held the title of Western Emperor, and most of them served for only a year or two, propped up, and often quickly discarded by whichever powerful general or barbarian military leader held the most actual influence at any given moment. The real power in these final decades tended to rest not with the emperor himself, but with commanders who held titles like Magister Militum, Master of the Soldiers, men who were often themselves of Germanic or mixed heritage, having risen through the ranks of an army that was now composed overwhelmingly of the same peoples the empire had once called barbarians. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals just how thoroughly the old categories had dissolved by this point. Rome's own defense by the final decades of the Western Empire depended almost entirely on soldiers and generals descended from, or directly belonging to, the Gothic, Vandal, and other Germanic peoples who had settled within or alongside its borders over the preceding century. The empire had not been conquered from outside so much as it had gradually become something different from within, a Roman political shell increasingly staffed, defended, and eventually controlled by people whose grandparents might have crossed the Danube as refugees. One of these commanders was a man named Orestes, who had served earlier in his career as a secretary to Attila himself. Another small detail that shows just how tangled these different worlds, Roman and Hunnic and Gothic, had become by this point in history. In 475, Orestes deposed the reigning Western emperor and installed his own young son on the throne instead, a boy probably no older than 12 or 13. The boy was given the grand imperial name Romulus Augustus, though we mostly remember him today by the somewhat diminutive form Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, a nickname historians later attached to him, whether out of gentle affection or quiet mockery for a child ruler who held no real power of his own. Let's return now to the scene we began with tonight and fill in the details a little more fully. Orestes, ruling in his young son's name, faced the same fundamental problem that had plagued Western Roman leadership for decades. He commanded an army made up substantially of Germanic soldiers, many of whom had been serving Rome or various Roman warlords for years. And these soldiers, like soldiers everywhere and always, wanted to be properly paid and increasingly wanted land of their own to settle on, the way earlier Gothic and Vandal groups had eventually secured for their own communities. In the year 476, these soldiers, led by a commander named Odoacer, himself of mixed Germanic heritage, demanded that Orestes grant them a substantial portion of land in Italy itself, essentially the same kind of settlement arrangement that had been extended to various barbarian groups elsewhere in the empire for the better part of a century. Orestes refused, perhaps because Italy itself, unlike more peripheral provinces, felt like a step too far, the last remaining core of Roman territorial identity that could not be surrendered without effectively ending any pretense of the empire remaining intact. Odoacer's soldiers rebelled. Orestes was captured and executed, and the young Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor who had never held any genuine power to begin with, was quietly deposed. Here is where the story becomes, in its own understated way, almost gentle rather than violent. Odoacer did not have the boy killed, which, given the brutal political customs of the era, was itself a notable act of restraint. Instead, he sent Romulus Augustulus into a comfortable retirement at a villa in the Bay of Naples region, reportedly granting him a substantial annual pension, and the boy simply disappears from the historical record after this point, presumably living out an ordinary, quiet life for years or even decades afterward, in a beautiful coastal setting far from the political chaos that had briefly and meaninglessly made him emperor. I want you to sit with that image for a moment because there's something quietly moving about it if you let yourself feel it. A boy, barely a teenager, who bore the weighty name of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor combined, was allowed to simply walk away from history and live out his life in obscurity, likely tending a garden or reading or simply growing older by the sea, entirely unaware or perhaps only dimly aware that later historians would eventually mark his brief, powerless reign as the symbolic endpoint of an empire that had shaped the entire ancient world for 5 centuries. And here is the detail that I think captures the true, strange nature of this ending better than anything else. Odoacer, having deposed the last Western emperor, did not declare himself emperor in turn. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia, the actual physical symbols of imperial authority, the crown, the purple robes, back to Constantinople, to the Eastern Emperor Zeno, along with a message stating that the West no longer required a separate emperor of its own, and that Zeno alone could now be recognized as the sole legitimate Roman emperor, ruling in name at least over the entire empire, while Odoacer himself would govern Italy as a king under Zeno's nominal authority. Think about what this actually means. There was no dramatic declaration of Rome's fall, no treaty formally ending the Western Empire, no single clear moment when anyone stood up and announced that this ancient institution, 500 years old, had officially come to an end. Instead, there was simply a quiet administrative letter sent from one ambitious military commander to a distant emperor, suggesting that a separate Western throne was no longer necessary. Many people living in Italy in the year 476 likely did not experience this moment as any kind of dramatic ending at all. Local governance continued. Roman law continued to be applied in many regions. Roman customs, Roman language, Roman religious practice, all of it continued largely unbroken. What had ended was simply a particular administrative arrangement, a separate imperial title for the western half of what had once been a single, unified empire. It's worth remembering, too, that the eastern half of the Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, did not fall in 476 and would not fall for nearly another 1,000 years, continuing in an unbroken line, calling itself simply the Roman Empire the entire time, until the city of Constantinople itself was finally captured by the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Historians today often refer to this eastern continuation as the Byzantine Empire, but that term was actually invented much later by historians looking back. The people living in Constantinople throughout this entire 1,000-year period continued to call themselves Romans right up until the very end. In a very real sense, then, Rome did not fall in 476 at all. What fell was only its western half, while its eastern continuation carried the name, the law, and much of the culture of Rome forward for another millennium. Let's take a slow, quiet moment here before we move on, simply to absorb the strangeness of this ending. An empire that had once stretched across 3 continents, that had built roads still used today in parts of Europe, that had given the world a legal tradition still studied by law students in the present day, that had shaped the architecture, the calendar, and even the language patterns of much of the modern Western world, came to its western end not with fire and thunder, but with a quiet letter, a retired boy tending a garden by the sea. And countless ordinary families across Italy who likely barely noticed in the moment that anything of great significance had happened at all. Before we go any further into the story tonight, let's take a small pause together. If you're still awake, still with me here in the dark, I'd love it if you left a quiet comment down below telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it happens to be for you right now. I always love reading through these in the morning, imagining all the different places this little story reached while people were falling asleep. Some of you just starting your evening, some of you already deep into the middle of the night. There's something quietly comforting about that. I think the idea that this same story is drifting through so many different bedrooms in so many different time zones all at once. All right, let's settle back in and continue. Life goes on, just differently. I want to spend some time now in the decades right after 476, because I think this period tells us something important. Something that gets lost when the fall of Rome gets compressed into a single dramatic date in a textbook. Odoacer ruled Italy as king for about 13 years, and life during his reign for most ordinary people would have looked remarkably similar to life in the final years of the Western Empire that preceded it. Let's go inside a Roman villa in the Italian countryside during this period, owned by a wealthy senatorial family who had weathered the political changes of the past century with their land and social standing largely intact. Picture a warm afternoon in early autumn, the estate's vineyards heavy with grapes ready for harvest, workers moving between the rows with wicker baskets, their conversation carrying across the fields in the still air. Inside the main house, built in the old Roman style with a central courtyard open to the sky, a mosaic floor depicting scenes from classical mythology stretches beneath the family's dining couches, worn smooth in places by generations of feet. The family still speaks Latin, still reads the classical authors Virgil and Cicero, still practices Roman law in their local dealings, still worships in a Christian church built in the familiar basilica style that had spread across the empire over the preceding century. The king ruling over them, Odoacer, and later his successor Theodoric, a remarkable Ostrogothic leader who took control of Italy in 493 after a prolonged and difficult conflict with Odoacer, were not attempting to erase or replace this Roman culture. Quite the opposite. Theodoric, in particular, deliberately styled his rule as a continuation and preservation of Roman civilization, employing Roman administrators, maintaining Roman legal codes for the Roman population even while Gothic law applied separately to his own Gothic soldiers and settlers, and investing considerable resources in maintaining and even restoring Roman public buildings, aqueducts, and monuments. Theodoric ruled from Ravenna for over 3 decades, and contemporary accounts describe a period of relative peace and stability in Italy under his reign, so much so that some later writers looked back on his rule with a degree of nostalgia, as one of the more genuinely well-governed periods in Italy's difficult 5th and 6th centuries. I want you to sit with this for a moment, because it complicates in a useful way the simple story we sometimes tell ourselves about barbarian invaders destroying a sophisticated civilization. Theodoric, a Gothic king who had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Constantinople, where he received a genuinely Roman education, understood Roman civilization deeply, admired it, and worked actively to preserve it, even as he ruled as an outsider to that same tradition by birth and heritage. The line between Roman and barbarian, by this point in history, had become almost impossible to draw with any real precision, and the most successful rulers of this transitional period understood that continuity, not destruction, was usually the wiser and more stable path forward. That said, we shouldn't paint too rosy a picture either. The overall trajectory of urban life, trade, and population across Italy and the rest of the former Western provinces did continue to decline in the decades and centuries following 476, though this decline had actually begun well before 476 and continued well after it, rather than being caused by any single event. Archaeological evidence from across the former Western Empire shows a gradual reduction in the scale and quality of building construction, a decline in long-distance trade networks that had once brought goods from across the Mediterranean to even modest provincial towns, and a slow shrinking of urban populations as cities that had once supported tens of thousands of residents contracted to a fraction of their former size over the following centuries. Let's go inside a different kind of scene now. In a small Italian town, perhaps 50 years after Romulus Augustulus quietly retired to his villa by the sea. Picture a marketplace that had once been bustling with goods brought from Egypt, Spain, and Gaul, now considerably quieter, selling mostly locally produced goods. the long trade networks that had once connected this small town to the far corners of the Mediterranean world having grown thinner and less reliable with each passing decade. A public bath that had once been maintained by imperial funding now shows signs of neglect. A cracked pipe left unrepaired, a section of the heating system no longer functioning, because the taxes and administrative structure that had once funded such maintenance across the whole empire no longer flowed in the same reliable way to distant provincial towns. This is not sudden collapse. This is the slow, quiet fading of infrastructure and connection that had taken centuries to build, and which would take centuries more to fully unravel, and eventually in different forms to be rebuilt. It's worth remembering, too, that this same period saw enormous continuity alongside this decline. The Christian Church, in particular, preserved and carried forward an enormous amount of Roman administrative structure, Roman language, and Roman learning throughout these centuries. Bishops often took on many of the practical governing responsibilities that Roman civic officials had once held, organizing charity, maintaining certain public functions, and preserving Latin literacy through monasteries and church schools even as secular education became less consistently available. In a very real sense, the Roman world did not simply vanish. It transformed gradually into the medieval world, carrying forward pieces of its language, its law, its religion, and its administrative habits, even as the specific political structure of a unified empire faded into memory. Let's take one more slow walk now, forward across the following centuries, to understand just how long the shadow of Rome continued to stretch across Europe, long after any emperor sat on a throne in the West. The long shadow of a fallen empire in the year 527, a little more than 50 years after Romulus Augustulus retired to his villa, a new emperor took the throne in Constantinople, a man named Justinian, who nursed an ambitious dream that most of his contemporaries likely considered impossible. He wanted to reconquer the West, to reunite the old Roman Empire under a single throne once again, undoing the fragmentation that had unfolded over the preceding century. For a time, remarkably, he very nearly succeeded. His brilliant general Belisarius led Roman forces that recaptured North Africa from the Vandals in 533 and 534, ending Gazaric's old kingdom roughly a century after it had first taken Carthage. Belisarius then turned to Italy itself, beginning a long, grinding campaign against the Ostrogothic kingdom that Theodoric had built, a war that would stretch on, with terrible destruction for the Italian population caught in the middle for nearly 2 decades. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the strange and bitter irony of this campaign for the ordinary people of Italy living through it. Here was an army calling itself Roman, sent by an emperor who considered himself the true heir of Augustus and Trajan, fighting to reclaim Italy from a Gothic kingdom that had in many ways preserved Roman culture, law, and administration more faithfully and more peacefully than the chaos of the preceding century had allowed. The long war that followed, sometimes called the Gothic War, caused far more widespread destruction to Italian cities, agriculture, and population than either Alaric's sack in 410 or the Vandal sack in 455 had ever inflicted. Rome itself changed hands multiple times during this conflict, its population dropping, by some estimates, to a small fraction of its former size. The ancient aqueducts that had supplied the city's famous baths and fountains for centuries finally cut and left in disrepair amid the fighting, some of them never fully repaired again for well over 1,000 years. Justinian did eventually reclaim Italy, along with parts of southern Spain, and for a brief window the Mediterranean world looked, once again, something like a single Roman Empire stretching around a shared sea. But this reconquest proved fragile and short-lived. Within just a few years of Justinian's death in 565, a new Germanic people called the Lombards invaded and conquered much of Italy, and the Eastern Empire's control over the peninsula fractured into scattered, disconnected territories that would take Italy over 1,000 years to eventually reunify as a single political entity again, not fully accomplished until the 19th century. Let's sit with that for a moment, because I think it's genuinely striking. The dream of reuniting Rome, of restoring what had been lost, did not die quietly after 476. It was actively pursued with real armies, real generals, and real sacrifice for generations afterward, and it came remarkably close to succeeding, only to fracture once again under new pressures. This tells us something important about how history actually unfolds, not as a single clean line moving steadily from one era into the next, but as a series of overlapping attempts, some successful, some not, by real people trying to hold onto, rebuild, or reimagine a world that felt to them worth preserving. The idea of Rome, meanwhile, continued to echo forward through European history in ways that went far beyond any single military reconquest. In the year 800, more than 3 centuries after Romulus Augustulus retired from the throne, a Frankish king named Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope in Rome itself, given the title Holy Roman Emperor, a conscious, deliberate attempt to revive the idea, if not the actual political structure, of a unified Christian Roman Empire in the West. This title remarkably persisted in various forms for another 1,000 years after Charlemagne, right up until Napoleon finally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. Think about that span of time. From Romulus Augustulus's quiet retirement in 476, to the final dissolution of an empire still calling itself Roman in name, over 1,300 years passed, an astonishing testament to just how powerful and enduring the idea of Rome remained in the European imagination, long after the actual empire that gave birth to that idea had faded from the map. And of course, the influence runs even further than that, into structures we still live inside today, in the year 2026, without necessarily thinking about their origins. The Latin language that Emilia and Marcus spoke by their fireside gradually evolved, across the former Western provinces, into the Romance languages we know today: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, each one a living descendant of the everyday spoken Latin of the late Roman world. Roman law, particularly as it was later systematically compiled under Justinian himself in a project called the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation for legal systems across much of continental Europe, and by extension, much of the world shaped by European colonial expansion in later centuries. Even the calendar we use today, with its months named for Roman gods and emperors, Julius and Augustus among them, and its basic structure inherited from reforms made under Julius Caesar, remains a quiet, everyday reminder of a civilization that most people encounter now only in history documentaries like this one, without realizing how much of its structure still shapes the rhythm of an ordinary week or an ordinary year. Let's slow all the way down now, and bring this long story to its close, the way we always do here, gently and without any rush. Britain, the province that drifted away before we close tonight, I want to take you to one corner of the empire we haven't visited yet, because its story unfolds a little differently than anything we've covered so far, and I think it rounds out our picture of just how varied this long, slow ending actually was across different parts of the Roman world. Let's go to Britain, the northernmost province of the entire empire, separated from the continent by a channel of cold, gray water, and connected to Rome in some ways more loosely than almost any other territory under imperial control. Roman Britain, by the early 4th century, had been part of the empire for roughly 350 years, since the Emperor Claudius first launched a serious invasion in the year 43. Over those centuries, a genuinely Romanized culture had taken root across much of the lowland areas of the island, particularly in the south and east. Towns like Londinium, which we know today as London, and Aquisulis, the elegant bathing town we now call Bath, had grown into proper Roman cities, with forums, temples, bathhouses, and villas decorated with mosaic floors depicting scenes that would have looked entirely familiar to a wealthy family in Gaul or Italy. Let's go inside one of these villas for a moment, somewhere in the countryside near modern-day Gloucester, on a cold evening in the early years of the 5th century. Picture a comfortable stone farmhouse, its rooms arranged around a central corridor in the practical style favored by British landowners of this period. A hypocaust system beneath the floor of the main reception room still, for now providing a gentle warmth rising up through the tiles, fed by a servant tending a fire in a stokehole outside. The family gathered here this evening, wrapped in wool cloaks despite the underfloor heating, since British winters demanded more layers than a villa in southern Italy would ever require. Might have been discussing news that had arrived days earlier from the continent, troubling reports of raids along the coast, and of soldiers being withdrawn from the island's garrisons to deal with crises elsewhere in the empire. This detail matters enormously for understanding Britain's particular fate. Beginning in the very last years of the 4th century, and continuing into the early years of the 5th, the Roman military presence in Britain was gradually stripped away, called back to the continent to help deal with the mounting crises we've spent this whole evening discussing: the crossing of the Rhine by the Vandals and their allies, the ongoing instability caused by usurpers competing for imperial power. Each time troops left, fewer remained behind to defend against raids from Irish sea pirates, from Pictish tribes in the north beyond Hadrian's Wall, and increasingly from Germanic seafaring peoples, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, probing the eastern coastline in search of land and plunder. By the year 410, the very same year Alaric's forces were sacking Rome itself, the Roman government in the West had effectively withdrawn from Britain entirely, in circumstances that remain genuinely unclear to historians even today. A letter attributed to the Emperor Honorius, writing to British communities, apparently told them to look to their own defenses, since Rome could no longer spare the resources to protect them. Some historians debate whether this letter was even originally addressed to Britain at all, or whether later writers simply assumed it was, given how neatly it seemed to explain what happened next. But whatever the precise circumstances, the practical result is clear. Britain, unlike almost anywhere else in the Western Empire, did not gradually transition into a barbarian successor kingdom that consciously preserved and continued Roman administrative structures, the way Theodoric's Italy or the Visigothic kingdoms in Spain and southern Gaul largely did. Instead, over the following century and a half, Roman Britain seems to have unraveled with a thoroughness that surprised even later medieval writers looking back on it. The towns that had thrived for centuries were gradually abandoned or shrank dramatically. The elaborate villa culture, with its mosaic floors and heated rooms, faded from the archaeological record within a few generations, many villas simply falling into disrepair and eventually being reused for far more modest purposes or abandoned altogether. Latin, which had been the language of administration, law, and much daily commerce in Roman Britain, was gradually replaced across most of the island by the Germanic languages brought by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose settlements expanded steadily westward over the following centuries, eventually giving the island the name we still use for its largest nation today, England, meaning simply the land of the Angles. I want you to sit with the strangeness of this particular ending for a moment, because it stands in genuine contrast to almost everywhere else we've visited tonight. In Italy, in Spain, in much of Gaul, Roman language, law, religion, and culture persisted and blended with incoming Germanic peoples, evolving gradually rather than being replaced outright. In Britain, for reasons historians still debate, involving some combination of a smaller pre-existing Romanized population, weaker administrative continuity, and perhaps simply a more thorough and prolonged period of violent disruption during the actual transition, something closer to a genuine cultural replacement took place across large portions of the island, at least in terms of language and visible material culture. Small pockets of Romano-British culture likely persisted longer in the western regions, in what is now Wales and Cornwall, where some scholars believe folk memory of a heroic resistance against the incoming Saxon settlers eventually crystallized, centuries later, into the legendary figure of King Arthur, though the historical reality behind that legend, if any exists at all, remains frustratingly difficult to pin down with any real confidence. Let's leave Britain now, this quiet, damp corner of the old empire, and return, for our final stretch tonight, to the broader question that has been running underneath everything we've discussed this evening. What did it actually mean to the people living through it that the world they knew was slowly, unevenly coming apart? The soldier's changing world. I want to spend a little more time, before we close, inside the experience of the ordinary Roman soldier, because the transformation of the army over these centuries tells us something important about the empire's slow unraveling that we haven't fully explored yet tonight. In the early empire, back in the world of Trajan that we visited at the very beginning of tonight's story, a Roman legionary was by law required to be a Roman citizen, and he served in a highly standardized professional army, trained according to consistent methods across the entire empire, equipped with roughly similar weapons and armor whether he was stationed in Britain or Syria, and serving a term of enlistment that typically lasted 25 years, after which he would receive a pension, often in the form of land, along with the full rights of Roman citizenship if he had not already possessed them at the start of his service. Let's imagine, for a moment, what daily life looked like for such a soldier, stationed at a fort along the German frontier sometime in the 2nd century. His day would have begun early with drilling and weapons practice, a discipline so consistent and thorough that Roman writers themselves often commented on it as one of the true secrets behind the army's long success. The idea that battles were, in a sense, won during the countless ordinary mornings of practice that preceded them, rather than through any particular brilliance in the moment of actual combat. Between training sessions, soldiers built roads, maintained fortifications, and even engaged in small-scale manufacturing, producing pottery, tools, and other goods within the fort itself. In the evening, they might gather in barracks rooms shared among 8 men, cooking simple meals of grain porridge, cured meat, and whatever local vegetables were available, the smell of wood smoke mixing with the leather and metal smell of stacked equipment along the walls. By the 4th and 5th centuries, this picture had changed considerably. As we've discussed throughout tonight's story, the army increasingly relied on foederati allied barbarian groups serving under their own commanders, alongside more traditional Roman units that were themselves increasingly recruited from frontier populations rather than from the interior of the empire, and which increasingly adopted equipment and tactics borrowed from the very peoples they had once considered foreign enemies. A Roman cavalry unit of the 5th century might be equipped with weapons and armor styles borrowed from Sarmatian or Hunnic horsemen, its officers bearing Germanic names, its common soldiers speaking a mix of Latin and various Germanic dialects around the evening campfire. This blending was, in many ways, a practical and even successful adaptation to changing circumstances. Some of the empire's most capable and loyal commanders in these final centuries, men like the Vandal-descended General Stilicho, who effectively ran the Western Empire for over a decade in the early 5th century before he too fell victim to court intrigue and was executed on the orders of the very emperor he had faithfully served, came from exactly this blended Roman barbarian military culture. Stilicho in particular is a figure worth pausing on because his fate captures a recurring, almost tragic pattern in this final chapter of the Western Empire. Time and again, the most capable defenders of Roman territory, whether Aetius, whom we discussed earlier, or Stilicho before him, were ultimately destroyed not by Rome's external enemies, but by internal suspicion, court politics, and the fear that a general who had grown too militarily indispensable might also grow too politically dangerous. I want you to imagine, for a moment, the particular exhaustion of being an ordinary soldier serving under commanders like these, watching capable leadership repeatedly undone by internal political suspicion, watching pay arrive late or not at all as the imperial treasury struggled with declining tax revenue from lost provinces. Watching your own unit's composition shift over the years as fewer recruits came from traditional Roman recruiting grounds and more from allied barbarian populations whose loyalty to a distant, increasingly abstract idea of Rome was understandably more conditional and transactional than the citizenship-based loyalty of earlier centuries. This is not a story of soldiers who stopped caring, or who deliberately betrayed the empire they served. It's a story of an institution, the Roman military, that had once been the most reliable and professional force in the ancient world, gradually adapting itself, generation by generation, into something that could still fight effectively, and often did, but which no longer had quite the same deep structural connection to a unified Roman state that its earlier incarnations had possessed. By the time we reach Odoacer's rebellion in 476, the soldiers demanding land in Italy were not outside invaders storming the gates. They were, in the most literal sense, the Roman army itself, or what remained of it, simply asking for the same kind of settlement and security that earlier generations of soldiers had received through the traditional pension system, a system the increasingly impoverished and territorially reduced Western government could simply no longer reliably provide. In some sense, then, the Western Roman Empire did not fall to its enemies. It fell in its very last moment to the ordinary, reasonable demands of its own unpaid soldiers, men who had served faithfully and simply wanted what soldiers throughout Roman history had always eventually received in return for their service. Faith in an uncertain age. There's one more thread I want to gently pull on before we close tonight, because it runs through this entire story, quietly shaping how people understood the enormous changes happening around them. That thread is faith, and specifically the remarkable rise of Christianity across exactly the same centuries we've spent tonight discussing. When our story began, back in the world of Trajan around the year 117, Christianity was a small, often persecuted minority faith, practiced quietly, sometimes in secret, by communities scattered across the empire's cities. By the time Romulus Augustulus retired to his villa in 476, Christianity had become the empire's dominant religion, its bishops wielding real social and sometimes political authority, its churches standing as the most prominent public buildings in cities across the Roman world, its theological debates occupying the attention of emperors themselves. Let's go inside a small church in a provincial town, sometime in the early 5th century, on a quiet Sunday morning. Picture a modest basilica-style building, its long central hall lit by rows of small windows high along the walls, the light falling in soft, dusty beams across a congregation gathered on simple wooden benches or standing along the sides. A bishop dressed in relatively simple vestments by later medieval standards leads the congregation through prayers and readings, his voice carrying easily in the building's plain, unadorned acoustics. Outside afterward, members of the congregation linger to talk, exchanging news and increasingly in these later centuries, seeking practical help from the church itself, food for a hungry family, mediation in a local dispute, even basic medical care for the sick, services that a strained and increasingly distant imperial government was less and less able to reliably provide. This growing practical role of the Church matters enormously for understanding how ordinary people experienced the slow decline of Roman civic institutions. As tax revenue declined, as the professional civil bureaucracy shrank, as roads and aqueducts fell into disrepair for lack of imperial funding, local bishops increasingly stepped into the resulting gap, organizing charity, negotiating with barbarian kings on behalf of their communities, and providing a sense of continuity and moral authority that helped many communities weather the uncertainty of these transitional decades. We saw this earlier tonight with Pope Leo I, meeting first with Attila and later with Alaric, acting essentially as a diplomat on behalf of a city whose actual imperial government could no longer reliably protect it. This was not an isolated case. Across the former Western provinces, bishops increasingly became the most stable and trusted local authority figures, filling a leadership vacuum left by the slow retreat of traditional Roman civic government. For ordinary families like the one we visited earlier tonight, Emilia and Marcus by their fireside, this growing role of the Church would have felt like one of the few genuinely stabilizing forces in an otherwise uncertain world. Their faith offered not just spiritual comfort, though it certainly offered that, but also a practical framework of community support, moral guidance, and social connection that helped hold local life together even as the larger imperial structure around them grew increasingly fragile and unreliable. It's worth noting, too, that this same period produced some of the most important and enduring works of Christian theology and philosophy in all of history, written by people living directly through the anxieties we've spent this evening exploring. Augustine of Hippo, whom we mentioned earlier dying as Vandal forces besieged his own city, wrote his great work examining faith and earthly power partly in direct response to the shock and grief following Alaric's sack of Rome in 410, addressing critics who blamed Rome's troubles on its abandonment of the old gods in favor of Christianity, and offering instead a vision in which earthly empires, however grand, were always temporary and imperfect compared to something more enduring that no barbarian army could ever threaten. There's something worth sitting with in that idea tonight, a genuine intellectual and spiritual response to civilizational anxiety, written not from a place of safety and distance, but from directly within the uncertainty itself, offering people living through Rome's decline a framework for finding meaning and stability that did not depend entirely on the political fate of any earthly empire, however grand that empire had once seemed. A world that grew smaller. I want to return, for a while, to the economic thread we touched on earlier tonight, because I don't think we can fully understand how Rome's fall actually felt to ordinary people without spending more time inside the slow shrinking of the world they knew. A shrinking that had almost nothing to do with battles or barbarian kings, and almost everything to do with grain shipments, road maintenance, and the quiet, unglamorous machinery of trade. Let's begin by imagining once more that thriving second-century world we visited at the very start of tonight's story, and then watch it contract, piece by piece, across the centuries. In the world of Trajan, a potter working in a workshop near modern-day Lyon might produce fine red pottery, a style we now call terra sigillata, and see it traded not just locally, but shipped along rivers and roads to markets hundreds of miles away, eventually turning up in households as far afield as Britain or the Rhine frontier. Archaeologists today can trace this pottery spread with remarkable precision, and what they find, layer by layer, century by century, is a genuinely elaborate interconnected trading network, functioning at a scale that simply would not be matched again in Western Europe for well over 1,000 years. By the 5th century, this picture had changed dramatically. Let's imagine that same kind of workshop in the same general region generations later. The potter working there now produces goods primarily for local use, perhaps selling to markets no more than a day's travel away, because the long-distance networks that once carried goods across the empire, the coordinated shipping routes, the relatively stable currency accepted everywhere, the reasonably safe roads patrolled by a functioning provincial government, had all grown considerably less reliable. This is what historians sometimes call the fragmentation of the late antique economy, and it's worth sitting with what it would have actually meant for daily life. Goods that had once been unremarkable and widely available, certain types of fine tableware, particular styles of glass, wine from specific well-regarded regions, became scarcer and more expensive, or simply vanished from local markets altogether, replaced by more limited, locally produced alternatives. I want you to imagine a household in southern Gaul during this period of transition, perhaps in the early 6th century, opening a cupboard that had belonged to a grandmother or great-grandmother, and finding, tucked away, a piece of fine imported pottery from a region that could no longer be easily reached through normal trade, treasured now not as an ordinary household item, the way it once would have been, but as something closer to an heirloom, evidence of a wider, more connected world that had quietly receded over the span of a single family's memory. There's something genuinely poignant in that image, I think, the way a broken piece of ordinary crockery could become, within a few generations, a small physical reminder of a world that had grown noticeably smaller. This contraction touched currency just as deeply as it touched trade goods. We talked earlier about the debasement of Roman coinage during the 3rd century crisis. But the story of Roman money across these final centuries is more complicated still. Different regions, as central authority weakened, increasingly relied on local coinage, sometimes minted by Gothic or Vandal kings themselves, often deliberately imitating Roman imperial designs to maintain a sense of continuity and trust, even as actual Roman political authority over that same territory had already faded. A merchant traveling from Italy to southern Gaul in the late 5th century might find that coins perfectly acceptable in Ravenna were viewed with suspicion or simply refused in a Visigothic market further west. A small, practical inconvenience that nonetheless reflected an enormous underlying shift. The slow fracturing of a currency system that had once functioned as a genuine common language of trade across the entire Mediterranean world. Let's also spend a moment on the roads themselves, since we mentioned them so admiringly at the very beginning of tonight's story. Roman roads had been built to an extraordinarily high standard, with proper foundations, drainage systems, and consistent maintenance funded through a well-organized system of provincial administration. As that administration weakened, road maintenance became increasingly inconsistent, particularly in more remote or contested regions. A traveler in the 6th century moving through certain parts of the former western provinces might still walk along genuinely excellent stretches of ancient Roman paving, remarkably durable even after a century or more of reduced upkeep, and yet encounter other stretches where flooding, erosion, or simple neglect had left the road badly damaged, forcing a detour along a rougher country path instead. This patchiness, some infrastructure remaining remarkably intact through sheer quality of original construction, other infrastructure crumbling for lack of ongoing care, is a genuinely accurate way to picture the physical landscape of the 5th and 6th centuries. Neither pristine continuity nor total collapse, but something messier and more uneven in between. There's a broader lesson here worth carrying with us, I think, about how complex systems tend to unwind. It rarely happens evenly. Some things persist for centuries past when you might expect them to fail, propped up by good original engineering or strong local leadership or simple inertia. Other things fail relatively quickly, once the specific conditions that sustain them, reliable funding, centralized coordination, a shared sense of common purpose across a wide territory, begin to erode. The Roman world's economic decline followed exactly this uneven pattern, a patchwork of persistence and failure rather than any single uniform collapse. The women who held households together. Before we bring tonight's story to its close, I want to spend a little time on a part of Roman life that ancient historians, mostly men writing for other men, tended to mention only in passing, if at all. The daily lives of women across these centuries of change, women who, in ways both ordinary and occasionally quite remarkable, held households, communities, and even kingdoms together through some of the most uncertain decades in this entire story. Let's return for a moment to Emilia, the woman we imagined earlier tonight by her hearth in northern Italy. Her daily responsibilities would have included far more than the evening meal we watched her prepare. Roman and post-Roman households of this period depended enormously on women's labor for the production of cloth, an activity so fundamental to household life that spinning wool was considered, across the entire span of Roman history, one of the defining virtues of a respectable Roman woman. Funerary inscriptions from across the empire, spanning centuries, praised deceased wives and mothers for their skill and diligence at the spindle and loom, a detail that might seem like faint praise to modern ears, but which reflected genuinely essential, labor-intensive work, since virtually all clothing, blankets, and household textiles in this era were produced by hand at home, primarily by the women of the household, sometimes assisted by daughters, servants, or enslaved workers depending on the family's wealth. I want you to imagine the actual physical rhythm of this work, since it's easy to mention spinning and weaving as a simple historical fact without really picturing what it involved. A woman preparing wool for spinning first had to clean it, removing dirt and grease from the raw fleece, then card it, combing the fibers into an even, workable mass using a pair of wooden paddles studded with short metal teeth. A repetitive, physically demanding task that might occupy an hour or more before any actual spinning could even begin. Spinning itself using a simple hand spindle weighted with a small clay or stone whorl was a task that could be done almost anywhere, while walking, while supervising children, while talking with neighbors, and it often was, women carrying a basket of raw wool and a spindle with them through much of an ordinary day, twisting fiber into thread during whatever spare moments presented themselves between other tasks. Weaving that thread into finished cloth required a proper loom, usually a large, upright frame set up in a dedicated corner of the home, and could take days or weeks of steady work to produce even a modest length of finished fabric. As the economic disruptions we discussed a moment ago made purchased cloth and finished goods increasingly expensive or difficult to obtain in some regions, this household production became, if anything, even more essential to family survival across the 4th and 5th centuries than it had been in more prosperous, stable times. A family that had once been able to purchase finer imported cloth for special occasions might increasingly find themselves relying entirely on homespun wool for every article of clothing in the household. A small, quiet example of how economic contraction reshaped the most intimate, everyday textures of family life. Beyond this essential domestic labor, women across this period also played more visible roles than the largely male-authored historical record sometimes suggests. We mentioned Galla Placidia only briefly tonight, but her story deserves a moment of its own, because it captures something remarkable about how thoroughly individual lives could be caught up in the great political currents we've been tracing all evening. She was the daughter of one emperor, the sister of another, and was actually captured by Alaric's Gothic forces during the very crisis that led to Rome's sack in 410, later marrying a Gothic king herself before eventually returning to Roman territory and ultimately ruling as regent for her young son, the Emperor Valentinian III, for over a decade, effectively governing the Western Empire during a genuinely difficult and dangerous period, arranging alliances, managing the ever-present tension with military commanders like Aetius, and commissioning some of the most beautiful surviving art and architecture from this era, including a small, exquisitely decorated mausoleum in Ravenna that still stands today, its interior covered in shimmering blue and gold mosaics depicting stars and religious scenes, a quiet, glowing space that remains, even now, one of the most moving physical remnants of this entire declining world. I want you to imagine, for a moment, standing inside that small building today, as many visitors still do, looking up at a deep blue ceiling scattered with golden stars, built and decorated at the direct order of a woman who had lived through captivity by a barbarian army, a difficult exile, and years of careful, exhausting political maneuvering to protect her son's throne during one of the most unstable periods in the empire's entire history. There's something worth holding onto in that image as we near the end of tonight's story. A small, glowing space of genuine beauty and care, created in the middle of an era of visible decline, by a woman who had personally experienced nearly every major thread of the story we've followed together tonight: invasion, captivity, political intrigue, and the difficult, unglamorous work of simply trying to hold a household, and in her case an empire, together for one more year, and then another, for as long as it could possibly be managed. The city itself, growing quiet. Let's return one more time to the city of Rome itself, and trace what happened to its physical fabric across these centuries, because I think there's something worth sitting with in watching a single, specific place change so dramatically across a span of time that would have covered many ordinary human lifetimes. In the 2nd century, at the height of the empire's prosperity, Rome was almost certainly the largest city the Western world had ever seen, home to perhaps 1 million people, an urban population size that would not be matched again in Europe until London and Paris finally grew large enough to surpass it, well over 1,000 years later. Imagine walking through Rome at this height, past the Circus Maximus, capable of holding 250,000 spectators for chariot races, past aqueducts striding across the countryside on tall stone arches, carrying fresh water from springs and lakes many miles away directly into the city's fountains, public baths, and even some private homes. An engineering achievement so impressive that some of these same aqueduct arches remarkably still stand today, nearly 2,000 years later. Quietly visible in the fields outside modern Rome. By the 6th century, following the Gothic wars we discussed earlier tonight, Rome's population had collapsed dramatically, from that peak of roughly 1 million down to perhaps 30 or 40,000 people, an almost unimaginable contraction. Let's imagine walking through that same city in this later period, and notice how different the experience would feel. Many of the old aqueducts, damaged or deliberately cut during the fighting between Gothic and Byzantine forces, no longer carried water into the city, forcing the remaining population to rely increasingly on the Tiber River itself, along with a handful of surviving wells and cisterns, for their daily water needs, a genuine step backward in basic infrastructure that would have felt, to anyone who remembered or had heard stories of the old system, like a real and tangible loss. Grand public buildings that had once hosted thousands of spectators or bathers now stood largely empty, some gradually stripped of their marble facing and decorative bronze fittings, materials that were valuable enough to be recycled for other construction projects or simply melted down, a practice that continued for centuries and explains why so many ancient Roman buildings that survive today, including the Colosseum itself, show clear scars where decorative elements were later removed. Entire neighborhoods that had once been densely packed with the multi-story apartment buildings we described at the very beginning of tonight's story gradually emptied out. And in some cases, the cleared spaces were eventually turned over to agriculture, vineyards and vegetable gardens growing within what had once been the heart of the largest city in the ancient world. A genuinely striking image if you let yourself picture it clearly. Cattle grazing near the base of monuments that had once celebrated triumphant emperors returning from conquered provinces on the other side of the known world. I want you to imagine, for a moment, an elderly resident of Rome in this later period, someone who might have been born during the final years of the Western Empire's independent existence and lived long enough to see the city through the Gothic wars, walking past the ruins of a bath complex that their own grandparents might have visited regularly, now silent, its pools empty, weeds growing up through cracks in the mosaic floor. There's a particular kind of melancholy in outliving the grandeur of a place you still call home, watching familiar landmarks slowly transform into something closer to ruins within your own single lifetime. And I think it's worth pausing to imagine that specific personal experience of loss, rather than only thinking about Rome's decline in the abstract. As something that happened to buildings and institutions rather than to real people who had grown up amid a certain scale of grandeur and watched it recede, year by year, around them. And yet, even in this diminished state, Rome did not become an empty ruin, whatever the more dramatic later legends might suggest. A reduced but genuine population continued to live within the city for the entire span of the medieval period that followed. The papacy remained headquartered there, drawing pilgrims and maintaining at least some continuity of religious and cultural significance. And gradually, very gradually, across the following centuries, the city began a slow process of partial recovery, never again reaching its ancient peak population until the modern era, but never entirely disappearing either. This slow, uneven persistence, neither the glorious continuity that Roman patriots of the 2nd century might have imagined for their eternal city, nor the total abandonment that the more dramatic tellings of Rome's fall sometimes suggest, is, I think, the most historically honest way to picture what actually happened to this single, remarkable place across the long centuries we've spent tonight exploring. What people ate as the world changed around them. I want to close our historical exploration tonight with one more gentle, grounding detail, something that connects every single person we've imagined together this evening, regardless of their wealth, their location, or which particular decade of this long decline they happen to be living through. Food and the quiet, daily rituals of preparing and sharing a meal. In the prosperous 2nd century, a family like the one we imagined at the very beginning of tonight's story, living in an apartment in Rome itself, would have eaten a diet built around a few reliable staples: bread made from wheat, often distributed at subsidized prices through the city's grain dole, supplemented with olive oil, wine, and whatever vegetables and legumes were seasonally available: lentils, chickpeas, cabbage, onions. Meat was a genuine luxury for most ordinary urban families, reserved for special occasions or festivals, though fish, when available and affordable, appeared somewhat more regularly on modest tables, particularly a fermented fish sauce called garum, used almost universally across Roman cuisine as a flavoring agent, its sharp, salty taste showing up in dishes from the wealthiest senatorial dining rooms down to the simplest roadside food stalls that catered to workers who had no proper kitchen of their own in their small apartment. Let's imagine, for a moment, one of these roadside food stalls, a thermopolium, in a busy Roman street sometime in the 2nd century. Picture a simple counter built into the front of a small shop, with large ceramic jars set into holes in the counter itself, keeping stews, legumes, and wine at hand for quick service to passers-by who had no room in their cramped upper-floor apartment for a proper cooking hearth of their own. A worker on his way to a construction site might stop here for a quick, warm meal of lentils flavored with garum and a bit of bread, paid for with a few small bronze coins, the whole transaction taking only a few minutes before he continued on his way through the crowded morning street. By the later centuries we've spent most of tonight discussing, this food landscape had shifted in ways that echo everything else we've traced this evening. The elaborate distribution networks that had once carried grain reliably from Egypt and North Africa to feed the population of Rome, and similar systems that fed other major cities, became increasingly unreliable as those very provinces slipped from direct Roman control, as we discussed earlier with the Vandal conquest of Carthage. Families across the shrinking Western Empire increasingly relied on whatever could be grown, raised, or gathered locally, a shift back toward a more regionally self-sufficient way of eating that, while perhaps less varied and less reliably abundant than the height of imperial trade had allowed, also proved in some ways more resilient to the political disruptions unfolding around it. Since a household that grew its own grain and kept its own small garden was less vulnerable to the failure of a distant grain fleet than a family that had depended entirely on subsidized imperial bread. Let's imagine one final time tonight, a modest evening meal in a small farming household somewhere in Gaul in the early 6th century, generations after the political structure of the Western Empire had faded away entirely. A pot of barley porridge simmers over the hearth, flavored with a bit of bacon fat and whatever herbs grow near the kitchen garden, bread made from a mix of wheat and rye baked earlier that day in a simple clay oven, a small cup of local wine, or increasingly common in regions further from the Mediterranean's traditional vineyards, a cup of fermented barley drink that would eventually evolve into the beer traditions of medieval and modern Northern Europe. The family gathered around this table, speaking a language that blended Latin vocabulary with Germanic influences, worshipping in a Christian tradition inherited directly from the Roman world, living on land whose boundaries and legal status still, in many cases, traced back to Roman surveying and record-keeping from centuries earlier, represents in the most quiet, ordinary way imaginable exactly what actually happened when Rome fell. Not a clean ending, and not a total erasure, but a slow, patient blending, meal by meal, generation by generation, of an old world fading and a new one quietly, steadily taking shape around its remains. So here we are at the end of a very long story, one that stretched across more than 300 years if you count everything from the crisis of the 3rd century through to the final fading of any meaningful Roman political control in the West. And I hope by walking through it slowly tonight, sitting in those quiet farmhouses and modest apartments, standing on the banks of the Danube with frightened refugees, listening to a family discuss tax burdens over a pot of lentil stew, you've come away with a somewhat different feeling about what the fall of Rome actually was than the dramatic single-moment collapse it's sometimes made out to be. It wasn't a single wall falling. It was thousands of small, quiet moments of strain, adaptation, negotiation, and gradual change, unfolding across generations, experienced by ordinary people who mostly just wanted to get through their own particular day, feed their own particular family, and make sense of a world that kept shifting slightly beneath their feet year after year, without ever announcing clearly what kind of new world was emerging on the other side of all that change. There's something worth carrying with us from this story, I think, beyond just the historical facts themselves. Civilizations, even the grandest and most seemingly permanent ones, are ultimately made up of ordinary people living ordinary days, adapting as best they can to circumstances mostly outside their control. The families we've spent time with tonight, real in their broad outlines, even where I've filled in specific details to help us feel the texture of their lives, did not experience themselves as living through the fall of Rome. They experienced themselves as simply living, gathering firewood, worrying about the harvest, listening for news from the road, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of continuing on, one evening at a time, through centuries that we now, looking back with the clarity that only distance can provide, recognize as one of history's great turning points. I hope wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever your own particular evening looks like, whatever quiet worries or ordinary tasks fill your own days right now, that this long walk through the past has given you a bit of company and a bit of rest. History has a way of reminding us that people have always found ways to endure uncertain times, to build small pockets of warmth and stability even amid enormous, slow-moving change, and to pass something forward however different it might look to whoever comes after them. If you made it this far, and I suspect a good number of you drifted off somewhere along the way, which is exactly what this channel is here for, thank you for spending this quiet stretch of your evening with me. If you're still awake, take a moment before you go to sleep to hit that subscribe button, so you don't miss the next long, quiet walk through history we take together here at the Quiet Past. And if tonight's story helped you relax, or if there's a particular era or civilization you'd like me to cover in a future episode, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, even the ones left in the middle of the night. Sleep well wherever you are, and I'll see you next time.